On behalf of Washington County 250th Committee, we are doing a series of these talks. This is the first kind of part of what we're doing now, and we've moved these talks around the county to kind of introduce people to what we're doing, is what we're hoping. We've been in Hebron, we've been in Cambridge, we've been in Fort Edward, now we're down in Salem, and so we are talking a little bit about what's going on with the Washington County 250th Committee movement. But before I do too much of that talking, I want to say thank you to the Salem Courthouse for putting this on. I didn't have to do a darn thing other than I did the press release, and hopefully all the grammar was correct.
Set up the chairs.
On there. And they took care of just about everything, and Al was a big part of that as well. And I want to thank Al, because there is a little bit of work to putting together, because this wasn't a program he had before, so he did this from scratch, and I really appreciate him doing that. The purpose of the 250th is, and I say this right away, to educate and to celebrate American history, the anniversary of our country. But I also, in our 250th, our saying is, and I can't keep it off the top of my head, we are celebrating history in your backyard. We're trying to focus on local history. We have a couple programs that are coming up. Of course, Al is going to talk about John Williams tonight, and John Williams is extremely important to Washington County, Charlotte County at that particular point in time, and what he did here politically, economically. The work that he did helped form what will be Washington County. Next month we have Gary Shattuck speaking. He wrote the book The Rebel and the Tory. It is a book on Ethan Allen and Philip Skeen. He is going to focus on Philip Skeen. And he had a good amount of material that he had gotten in England that he had not used, and he put together an original talk as well.
Will that be here?
It will be in the Sandy Hill Arts Center in Kingsbury.
I can walk to that.
There you go. There you go. That's the purpose. Let's try to contact as many people as we possibly can. I've forgotten what we have in April. I apologize.
Showers.
Yeah, showers. Yeah, we're going to have showers. Thanks, Al. I appreciate that. We do have a Living History Weekend in May. It is May 18th and 19th. It will be at both the old Fort House in Fort Edward and at Rogers Island. We are going to hopefully have our crafts people on the front lawn of the old Fort House, and we're going to have our military groups. And it's going to be what they call a timeline. It will be starting with the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. I get a call from a young lady who's starting a group on Afghanistan, troops that were in Afghanistan at that particular point in time. So April one came to me. I know it would. Usually I'm out walking out the door when it comes to me. We are having a talk down in Greenwich. The gentleman's name is Paul Walker. He was an engineer. He went back and got his PhD, I think from the University of North Carolina. And his talk will be on Thaddeus Kosciuszko and his part during the American Revolution in this area, because he was the main engineer for the Americans at Saratoga. So that will be the 25th, I believe, of April. Check the Facebook, check the website. It will be coming soon enough. I just want to give Al a quick introduction. I've known Al since 1983 when he hired me, so I have to say nice things. He was good enough to hire me at that particular period of time. I taught history and alternative ed at that moment. What I've seen of Al since 1983, Al is the cornerstone of history in Salem, if not the cornerstone of what goes on in Salem. I was always amazed at the fact that Al did so many things in the community. I mean, he was involved with the church, he was the town historian, he was involved in the Rotary, he did so many different things, and he kept it all going because he knew how to use his people very effectively, and he did very effectively. He knew the people that would work, he went to them, he knew what their strengths were, and he still does that today. And he has been a fantastic person in Salem for this long period. There's no better person to speak about John Williams. Al's been probably close to 30 or 40 years of doing town historian work. I know he's the acting historian right now. But Williams is one of the founders, and it should be, as I said, spoken about. He was a physician. He was a businessman, he was a politician on the local and state level, and he was a military leader as well. So I want to thank you on behalf of Washington County 250th, and I'm going to speak for the Salem Courthouse for coming in and supporting the program tonight. Thank you very much. Al.
Thank you, Pat. Now you expect me to live up to that introduction.
Well, you did the same thing not long ago.
I'm going to tell you how we will be approaching this tonight. As I was trying to put this together, I said, can I do it chronologically, or should I just do it event-wise, or should I just do it based on some of the things that General John Williams did when he was living here? So I'm ending up not in a pure chronological order. I'll be talking to you about a lot of things that you won't find in the history books. Because as I did more research, I kept uncovering things that I didn't know, and I never read them anyplace. The Library of New York State has a bunch of Williams papers, and they in turn put out a catalog, and the catalog is pretty dry when you look at it. You have General John Williams, born in Barnstable, England, and then so on, a whole list of offices and things that he did. Does not really tell you much about the general or his life. What did he do on Tuesday in 1779? We don't know. We don't know. It's unfortunate that we don't, but that's the way things work sometimes. So I'm going to follow that particular pattern, and Pat Niles has just a picture of the mansion, and then on the back side is a picture of General John Williams, so you'll have an idea of what he looked like. Start at the back.
Yep.
This is still here, Al, huh? This is still standing.
No, that's gone.
No.
That's gone. The picture, when you look at it, you'll see it's a photograph of the mansion taken years ago. It's not there anymore. The school is in its place. And on the back side is a picture of General John Williams. I'll talk about that later on in my talk.
And it'll go back this way.
The first thing I want to point out today is the uniform. This is not an official uniform. It's a replica of continental blue uniform that a general might wear. And as you look at it, say, why isn't that in continental blue? Because that was the official color. This is general in the militia. The militia were allowed to pick their colors, at least with a hat. And so General John Williams chose that particular color hat. The other thing you may notice is that it was difficult to get out of these uniforms. Usually you have somebody who helps you get dressed. And you say, why are they doing that? And to get undressed, you've got a gazillion buttons right here. And it takes a long time to get out of those. I checked the buttons because I wondered what they were valued at. And I found this in the uniform bag. And it said 1796 uniform, made by Helen Sheridan. Says the buttons were worth $3 in 1976. So I checked the buttons out on the internet, and now they're worth $15. So Joan, you put those scissors down. So the uniform, having the uniform made, I'm sure, was quite expensive. But here it is, and I have worn this uniform for the kids at school. 4th grade does American history, and it's nice to dress up in the uniform to give them an idea. I used to have more hair then. You notice some of it's up here. The hair at that, I mean, most of the men had ponytails. Unless you were an official, a judge or something of that nature, then you might go to a wig. I think if the general were going to go to an official event, he might have worn the white wig, which was common at that time.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Did you go to the school in Hartford a few years ago and they had
No.
the guys there? No?
No, that was not I. It must have been some other general.
Yeah.
Now, the uniform, this,
Is that a vest?
yes, this is a vest made out of linen. I had that made specially for the uniform. There was no vest with the uniform. I think over the years, part of the uniform got lost.
Oh,
So you had a vest, you had pantaloons, and then white socks worn with it, and for dress occasions, white gloves. What we don't have here also is a sash that would go around the waist, and sort of a scarf that would go around the neck. Those things are missing.
He didn't have any gorgets?
Anyway,
Gorgets? Gorgets on his neck.
This, the armor, it's the silver, it's a piece of, it goes back to the
yeah,
armor.
yeah, I know what you mean.
Where'd you put your weapons? Or
Okay.
that was dress?
Well, that's, yeah, this is dress, but any weapon would have been a sword and a scabbard, and we don't have that as such. So any other questions about the uniform? The gold might have been real gold. This is not. Of
Nice.
course, just sort of gold-looking grade.
How much did that uniform cost?
Yep.
How much did it cost?
I have no idea.
Oh, I meant back then. I mean,
Yeah, Jim McMorris had the uniform made. Jim was a great history buff, just loved history. In fact, when I first came here, I said, well, what happened in Salem? Anything happened? He said, read this book, and he handed me the history of Washington County. And in the first 60 pages by that particular author tell all about the politics, the wars, commerce in the county. And I said, wow, Salem was once a very wealthy place.
Yes.
It had the largest population north of Albany. Wow. Said I didn't know that. And the nice thing about it was I started to, just to think about it a little, saying, the public should know this, because as I talked with people, they had no idea. I put up some signs saying Historic Salem, and one day I had somebody say, what's historic about Salem? Okay, I see where I am and where I've got to go. So actually it was the Rotary Club who first put up all the signs around the village, so that you got a welcome to Historic Salem with a date on it. So.
Did Jim work here?
Oh yes, glad you brought that up.
Did he?
Jim McMorris was the undersheriff here for many years, lived across the street. And as I mentioned, he just loved history, and he was also the timekeeper for all the basketball games at school. So he was well known in the area. Okay, so much for uniforms. At least so much for that uniform. Now, as I started to do my research, I remembered something that I learned at the Washington County Preservation Organization that I was with for a few years. And I remember, I cannot remember her name, but a woman sitting next to me said, "Oh, by the way, we have General John Williams' uniform up at Fort Ty." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." Well, I did not run up to Fort Ty right away. About 20 years later, I went to Fort Ty. I called them up and said, "Here's what I'm looking for." And they said, "Come along." I set a date and a time, and I went up to look at the uniforms. And the curator dragged out this box and opened it up. And inside were 2 uniforms. One was red, one was blue. Well, obviously the blue one was the continental color. And the red one, we didn't know. And then I discovered something about John Williams that I had no idea about his siblings. Here was a letter that was in the box. I'll read it to you. And this was addressed to John Pell, who the Pells owned Ticonderoga for many, many years. It says, "My cousin, Mrs. Blake Lawrence, who has just sailed for England, asked me to write you concerning a uniform Mrs. Tobin had sent to you at Fort Ticonderoga Museum, said to be the uniform of General John Williams of Salem. My sister Clara and I, as great-great-grandchildren of John Williams, have his portrait by J. Wesley Jarvis." I'll talk about Jarvis a little later. "Also, the Williams genealogical record, but we have never seen the uniform and cannot give a description. In any case, if the coat is red, it cannot have been worn by John Williams, who was never in the British Army, but had served as a surgeon in the Royal Navy and would have worn a blue coat. We do not remember the color of the uniform of the Charlotte County Rangers," which didn't surprise me because the early militia, the Minutemen, and early Rangers didn't have a uniform. They just wore their everyday clothing. They might put a feather in a cap or a pine cone or something to identify them when they were out there, but they never wore a uniform. But she goes on and said, "But it certainly was not red." And to finish up, she said, "John Williams came to Salem and settled down and died there. His body is in the family tomb. John Williams came to this country in 1773 from Barnstable, England, at the age of 21, with a medical diploma or license from the University of Edinburgh. He met the best doctors in the world in New York and Albany. At White Creek, which is Salem, he married Susanna Thomas Turner and built the Williams homestead." And that's the picture that we sent around for you. In 1776, he was commissioned colonel of the Charlotte County Rangers, a regiment of infantry, and he served as a surgeon at that time. He was ordered by General Gates to march to the relief of Ticonderoga. But on the way there, they were told that St. Clair had already surrendered. And this is a pivotal thing because John Williams and Philip Schuyler were very close. Philip Schuyler at that time was the commander of the Northern Theater. But when Fort Ticonderoga fell, they needed somebody to blame, so they sacked him and brought in General Gates to handle the battle. And it's interesting because after Saratoga, General Gates left and went to another battle which he lost completely. And General Schuyler was reinstated. They took him to court-martial and said, no, he didn't do anything wrong, so he should have his rank back, which is what they did. Now, the other thing I discovered is the fact that John Williams had a brother, and I never knew that. I've never seen that ever mentioned in any of the Salem history. But proof of it is, it comes across in letters and a will that I found, George Williams's will. And it does appear that he, of course, was a British soldier. He would have been here with General Howe at that time, but what we don't know is whether he deserted the British Army or whether his time was up, so he just left. You know, the war was over, no point in being there. He didn't want to go back to England, perhaps. At any rate, he ended up moving in with John Williams. And the more research I did, I keep discovering things. Yes, he was a landowner. He lived either with John Williams for a while and then built his own house here in Salem. I tried to find out the names of parents, and I got on the web. In fact, I even sent a questionnaire off to England. And the answer I got back was they did find the material. They're saying, yep, he trained here to be a surgeon, etc. But they had no knowledge of who his parents were. But someplace out there, there is somebody who knows that. The other thing I discovered that was difficult, there was a time before we all had middle names. And there are a gazillion John Williams or Jonathan Williams. And those can be confused because the abbreviation for Jonathan is John, and same thing for John. So that's a little difficult, and I haven't tracked that down completely. Now, George's wife was Isabel, and he did not have a will. So anyway, they went to probate, what we call today probate, and they decided in probate that based on the contents of the house, which would be listed here, of all the items in the house, and then the courts would decide, okay, we'll either sell this or sell that, and they had 2 children, and those children would receive some of the value at that time. So let that be a warning to us. Have a will. Makes it a lot easier.
Back then it wasn't the rule to pass it down to the heirs. Why did they?
Well, well, the court would do that. But if he'd had a will and said, I bequeath all my money to my wife and my 2 kids, there would be no question. You know, then they would say, yeah, it's all mine.
But they didn't leave it to his wife either, did they?
Well, didn't have to. You never knew what the court was going to do.
So that's one way the court makes money, by doing it that way,
Well,
selling off stuff.
I don't know. Letters of it. The county has hundreds of letters of administration, which is the same thing. They just say, here's what I have. Here are all my assets, and they would list 12 plates, 16 pewter
Chairs,
mugs or
tables,
whatever, and
plaques.
that becomes then somebody would look at it and say, oh yeah, all that stuff is worth 50 pounds. Because, we still had English law at that time, so. Okay. Now, one of the general's attributes was that he was a terrific surgeon. He did get trained, served at the St. Thomas Hospital in Edinburgh, and earned a license in 1773. He came over to the United States on a man of war as a surgeon. And again, don't know why he stayed here, but he decided to stay here. And I don't know what a surgeon on a man of war got paid, but he went to Paulet, Vermont, and bought some property for 90 pounds, British pounds. Was 2,000 acres that he purchased. Now, today's value, 2,000 pounds equals $20,000. And of course, the question is, where did he get that money. Because I'm sure a surgeon is not paid a heck of a lot, any more than those sailors that were on the boat. So the more I looked into this, I ended up with more questions that I had answers to. And so if you have an answer, let me know. Just shout it out. Now, while he was still in England doing his internship, we'll say, learning how to become a surgeon, he also joined a group of people called Mountbattens. Now that's a name, really has two meanings. One is to fool the public, and the other one dealt with selling patent medicines. Now it is known from Salem writings that he loved magic tricks. And you have to think back to that time. People were very superstitious. They believed in magic. And we had a famous person here was brought to court because people said, she's a witch. She poisoned my cow. She killed my cat. So that was the thinking at that time. So in many instances, he would use trickery when he was in trouble because he knew how to, well, I would call it hypnotize people because he knew what to do. So that was sort of a sidelight with him. Now in 1773, by that time, he left his property in Paulet and came to Salem, coincidentally, correspondingly with a smallpox epidemic. The wealthiest people in town lived on Main Street. They owned the tavern, which was very popular.
Was that Turner's?
Yes, this was Turner. There's a little sign on the building that says this was where the Turner Tavern is gone, but the plaque is there saying this is where the site of it. Now, while he was here, he stayed at the tavern, and James Turner, the owner, came down with smallpox. So he was treating, all the patients of smallpox and James Turner. Quick turn of event. James Turner died. Could not save him. And lo and behold, about a year later, who marries his widow? John Williams. So he marries into one of the most wealthy people in the village of Salem. So now we know perhaps where some of his money came from, because over the years he's a wheeler and dealer in real estate and a whole lot of other things. So it was the Turner money that helped him to keep going in the county, and was not by chance. He was not a stupid person. As you read through his history, he was very intelligent and knew what he was doing. Now, Mrs. Turner had 4 children, and after John married her, they had 4 more children, and all of them managed to. They married very well as they grew up. So the Williams family sort of expanded. Not only in the Williams side, but the Proudfit side also, and the Bancroft side. So you have, sort of this burgeoning, wealthy group of people right here in Salem.
Mostly girls, huh? Mostly
Yes,
daughters.
yes, mostly girls. Now, a little bit about his military. Oh, just before I go on, I did find in the history of Washington County one mention of George Williams. This was in dealing with a doctor by the name of James Green, who came to Salem, in keeping in mind that our John Williams was a doctor, so he knew a lot of the doctors. But here it says, James Green was born in Cambridge, studied medicine with Dr. Williams of Salem. And in an advertisement that he put in the paper, that is green, he notifies the people of Salem that he has taken a part of George Williams's house where he intended to practice physic and surgery. So now we know George Williams did have a house. And then he, in his ad, he said he has on hand a supply of brimstone, salts, Hoopers and Anderson's pills, court plaster, and so on. So even he panhandled a little bit in the patent medicines. Later on in the same history book, it points out that George Williams' dwelling house was Lot 51, and lo and behold, Lot 51 was next to a Lot 52, which was owned by John Williams. So there's another connection. Now he got very interested in politics. Even when the war was on, he was involved in politics of some sort, either at the local, county, state, national level. Very influential. He was originally an anti-federalist. Eventually he switches. He becomes a federalist, but not after he sees that some changes have been made and added to the Constitution. A fellow by the name of Joel Johnson wrote a 20-page article dealing with writings that were found in the newspapers at that time. It's a little controversial because John Williams, according to what this guy said, wrote under pseudonyms, Brutus and Cato. And they were anti-federalist tomes about certain things. He was very concerned that federal government would end up like a monarchy, and he did not want that to happen. And just to read to you a little bit about that, in 1788, General John Williams was a state senator as well as brigadier general of the county militia, and a delegate to the New York Constitutional Convention in Poughkeepsie. There he and fellow anti-federalists argued against ratification of the proposed federal constitution. Williams and members of his party were extremely fearful lest the proposed constitution result in a tyranny of the federal government over states' government and ultimately over the people themselves. And here's a quote from him. He says, "Let us examine whether it, the proposed constitution, be calculated to preserve the invaluable blessings of liberty and secure the inalienable rights of mankind. If so, let us adopt it. But if it found to contain principles that would lead to subversion of liberty, if it tends to establish a despotism, or what is worse, a tyrannical aristocracy, let us insist upon the necessary alterations and amendments. In forming a constitution for a free country like this, the greatest care should be taken to define its powers and guard against an abuse of authority. The Constitution should be so formed as to not swallow up state governments. The general government ought to be confined to certain national objects, and the states should retain such powers as concern their own internal police. We should consider whether or not this system is so formed as directly or indirectly to annihilate the state governments. If so, care should be taken to check it in such a manner to prevent this effect." Now, why is that important? If any of you remember studying the Constitution, You certainly know that in the Constitution you have a Bill of Rights. And this is where it started, with General John Williams, right here in Salem. Probably you might even be standing where he is, right? It was at one time. Now, as I said, we did have a fellow by the name of Johnson who wanted to prove that John Williams wrote all these articles that were in the paper. And he does an amazing 20-page study that gets printed in the American Antiquarian Society in 2009. But he defends his theory that it was John Williams who wrote Brutus and Cato articles and not any of the other people who, were on his same level. And he does a very nice job. He says people will still disagree with me, but this is why I think he did it, and he would show what did John Williams say at the convention, and what was written in these essays in the newspaper. And he said, look at the language. Same elements, same themes. So his conclusion was he was very, very influential in making sure that states' rights were upheld. Sounds a lot like what we're doing today, in a sense. Now, on the local level, he was influential in making Salem the county seat. Anybody here from Fort Edward? Hudson Falls? There was a big argument as to whether it should be here, but John Williams carried a lot of weight. And so they built the first courthouse here on Main Street, along with a jail. And that meant with the jail here, then the court would be held here in Salem. And when that wooden building just fell apart in 1869, they put this place up. But in the interim, Fort Edward politicians, Hudson Falls politicians, started to scream, saying, hey, it's not right. Why should you be the seat of the county? You're way over near the Vermont border. We think it should be more to the center of the county. Well, there was a big argument as to what to do, and finally the agreement was that another courthouse would be built in the county. They would handle certain aspects of litigation. So now we have two places. And Salem was known as a half shire in the county, and Fort Edward was known as a half shire in the county. Of course, now there's not much in Fort Edward. Our courthouse is in Hudson Falls. But it just gives you an idea of the politics that took place at that time. And he was very influential in seeing that those things happened. Now, some of the things that he did during the war in 1775, he was a member of the Committee of Safety in Dorset. And people have said, in Dorset? What's he doing in Vermont? Well, at that time, Dorset was not in Vermont. Dorset was in New York State. So that's why you have that reference. And the Committee of Safety said, hey, we need some protection. What can you do? And at that time, Governor Clinton decided, well, yes, we need something. And they asked Williams to be the commander of area militia groups. You had a Salem militia group, you had Hebron militia groups, and you had Rangers also. So he accepted that, and at times he was a commander, other times he was just a surgeon. So he did both things at different times. Now those people who were mentioned in the book. He commanded the Charlotte County Rangers, and Majors Hamilton, McCollister, and James McCracken are local names. They had their own companies, and in 1786 he finally was named the Brigadier General of the Washington County Militia. And then he would wear a uniform like this. Now, Salem was in a way in the middle of the conflict at that time. In 1775, the Rangers went to Skenesboro, that's Whitehall today, to capture Colonel, which is a title he gave himself. Otherwise, he was known as Lord Skene. He was never a member of the military. So they were going to capture Lord Skene. The Rangers got there, and Skene was not there. Skene had boarded the ship, and he'd gone home for whatever reason. But the Africans who were there to protect the place put up a little fight, but nothing. Nobody was hurt. The Rangers went into the house. We call it a mansion, and they pretty much sacked the house at that time, and discovered a whole lot of things there. There are two interesting points. They went into the basement of the house and they discovered a lead coffin. And of course, lead was valuable at that time because you needed the lead to make the round bullets. The story is that this was Skene's departed wife. Of course, the question was, why isn't she buried? Turns out that her family, her parents, was giving them an endowment as long as she was above ground. So she was there. Now, what we don't know is, did they take her outside and bury her because they wanted the lead from the coffin? We don't know. The other interesting thing that happened there, like I said, there were slaves. There was a young mulatto, a girl, 7-year-old girl by the name of Sylvia, and Captain Barnes decided to bring Sylvia back to Salem. Not as a slave, though. The argument was that she was the daughter of Lord Skene, and she was mulatto. It had similarities. But Sylvia lived out her whole life here, never as a slave. She was very intelligent. Her gravestone pointed out her value, and wonderful person, etc., etc., etc. So the mystery now is she was buried in the Revolutionary War Cemetery, and she's no longer buried there. Supposedly she's buried in Evergreen Cemetery, the Victorian cemetery up on the hill, but nobody knows where. Which is, sort of interesting, because in that Victorian cemetery, there are 3 cemeteries outside of the cemetery wall, one of them being the African grounds. Because at that time, African Americans were not buried within the regular cemetery. They had a separate plot at that time. So it's a mystery now where she's buried. But somebody with influence disinterred her body and brought it up to Evergreen. She might be buried in somebody's plot, like Dr. Asa Fitch might have been something he did, but there was so much respect for her that she ended up being buried in the cemetery proper.
Did they melt the lead up?
Sorry.
Did they melt the lead up from the coffin?
I'm assuming they did. The question was, did they melt the lead? If they took it home, they probably did.
Al, you kind of leave me hanging here about this lady named Sylvia. Last name, and what did she do here in Salem?
Sylvia married a fellow by the name of Burke. Uh, There's a whole book written about the African Americans living here in Salem. A guy by the name of, let's see, Lloyd, I've forgotten his last name, I think I have the book here. At any rate, this is a sort of a side story. I got a phone call one day from this fellow saying, I'm trying to locate my relatives, I can't find them, I don't know. He said, give me the names. He gave me the names, and I said, I think they're buried here.
Wow.
So he came up to meet with me, and we went to the African grounds at Evergreen. We went to the Revolutionary War Cemetery, where we discovered two of his ancestors who were slaves at one time. They were buried there. But he, in turn, then wrote a second book called New York State's Manumission of Slaves, which took a number of years to accomplish until we finally, the state said, okay, you're all free. You were free. But I should point out, this is a good time to do that. The question comes, did we have slaves in Salem? We did. We had slaves all over New York State. At one time, there were 29 slaves, 1790 census said we had 29 slaves here. Who owned the slaves? The wealthy
Did General Williams?
owned the slaves. General Williams, yes, General Williams owned, I think it was 4 slaves. And we had ministers, prominent ministers who owned slaves. And being an optimist, I like to think that they were African Americans and they were called slaves. There is no record as to whether they were bought or whether they were,
Volunteer.
well, not sure, they might have volunteered, but enticed to come here to be a maid, a servant, someone who took care of the horses, things of that nature. In my readings, I have never found anything that said they were mistreated in Salem. In fact, over the years, early on, people started freeing the slaves. And that shows up in the town minutes in the Washington County history book. So that by the time you get to the year that New York State finally said all slaves are free, there were no slaves left in Salem to free, because the owners had said, you can go out on your own, or you can stay here to work for me. And a lot of them just stayed. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, but they might have had a skill that was, really important. And so they would stay and they would get paid whatever the owner of the property wanted to pay them. Now, an interesting thing, the statue of Philip Schuyler, who was a slave owner, was removed from the
Albany.
courthouse in Albany about 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. Maybe even,
Well, they talked about it, they just moved it.
It's gone now.
They
Right up in front of
just
City Hall
took it,
now.
yeah, they just took it,
It has no home right now.
right.
yeah, it's gone. The interesting thing is, Tom Wood, who was a teacher here and was the supervisor there for a while, according to Pat, wanted to bring the statue to Schuylerville. Said, we'll take it.
That makes sense.
They're still
Well,
waiting.
Didn't they just discuss this on the news? That's what I heard.
Yeah.
That was the supervisor from Saratoga County, the chair
okay.
of the board of supervisors.
Okay.
Yeah. It points out an interesting conflict, at least with me. I don't know how you feel about it. I mean, we have statues being removed in the South. A number of years ago, friends and I went down to Resaca to celebrate a monument that was being put up for the 123rd. And one of the speeches was given by the Sons of the Confederacy, and basically it was really geared to defend their method of saying the war was not about slavery, it was about something else.
Lost cause.
Yes, the lost cause. What was interesting to us, it's not that there weren't people at this organization or this event who were not smart. The ones we talked to, teachers primarily, immediately said, yeah, we know it was about slavery. They didn't try to hide behind it. I said, you know, what are you teaching there in your classrooms? And they were very honest. They said, yeah, we know outside this is what I said, but we have to teach history as it is. So I was glad to hear that from them. There was a reenactor at the event we went to dressed in Sherman's, no, not Sherman, I'm sorry, Lee, in General Lee's uniform. And I went over to visit with him, and immediately he started this spiel of, you know, all these wonderful things the general did and so on and so on. And the general was very intelligent. And then we got to talking about slavery. And he said, oh, well, it would have petered out eventually. When is that? And my retort was, would you like to be a slave? And he wouldn't answer me. No answer. So you still have some mindset that slavery was good. We treated them well, except in the movies where they always beat them up. It's a different atmosphere and a different interpretation of what happened. Okay. Now, Salem's part in the war, we had our rangers, we had our militia. When Burgoyne started to come down from Lake Champlain and the news came here, a fort was immediately built on West Broadway. I'm sorry, East Broadway, where the brick church is.
Fort Salem.
Yeah, where Fort Salem is right now, in that area. There is a marker there. The fort was manned by local militia, but when the word came down in Burgoyne's proclamation was, just stay in your houses and be good and nothing will happen to you, except, he didn't put it in the writing, except I can't control the Indians, so they might just want to scalp me. So, at any rate, the militia got called away. The fort was left abandoned. Everybody in town beat it out of town because they were afraid for their lives. And while they were gone, then the history says it was not British soldiers or German soldiers. It was people who just lived in the community. The Indians were here, and the fort got torched and burned to the ground. Now, a year later, another fort was built. That fort was built on what we call Mill Hill, across from the old shirt shop. But that was not a stockade fort. It was a log fort, much more substantial than the other one. And at times it was occupied by local militia. Other times, because General John Williams had contacts in Connecticut, you had Connecticut troops coming up to be in that fort. I don't think there's anything left of that fort now, probably. They're all wooden, so those remnants are gone.
Has
But
any
that was-
archaeology been done?
Pardon?
Has any archaeological dig been done there?
No,
But we don't know what's,
no,
there's gotta be something there.
probably. Now, Tories, the rule of thumb is this. People say, well, what do the population think? And what I read was a third of them wanted to be free of England. A third wanted to be loyal to the king, and the other third didn't give a darn.
Didn't matter.
Yeah,
Kind of like today?
yes, something familiar today. But our big Tory area was in Camden Valley. Anybody here from Camden Valley? Camden Valley is in the
Up there.
southeastern part of Salem, and primarily Tories. When the war broke out, they left. So Camden Valley was sort of a ghost town.
Was that Philip Embry's Methodist down there? Because I know his son was a loyalist and took a lot of them to Canada when they left Camden Valley.
Yeah, there were some loyalists. They were not all Tories, but yeah, and it was a religious community. One of the aspects of this area is a lot of the communities we have, like Salem, the village at that time in Camden Valley, were based on religion. Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians.
Those Moravians. and
Yeah,
shit.
and that's right, the German Moravian church down in the valley.
And two kinds of Presbyterians.
Yes, two kinds of Presbyterians, good and good. Stay up. You're trying to get me into trouble. I tell you.
Was there a large number of loyalists over, I mean, because the Argyle colony from the, after the French and Indian War, most of those were former Highland soldiers and stuff that were brought over there. Wasn't that
Yeah.
a large colony of,
Well,
all sorts of
yeah, you
loyalists
probably
there?
have heard the name of Soldier's Patent. In Argyle, you have a group of soldiers who fought in the French and Indian War. And as their reward, they were given land.
And what,
And today, they're known as the Free Scots, and even when you go over there and talk to people, they say, oh yeah, my relatives were the Free Scots.
have
And if you look on the
a
patent map, you can
down.
see this group of parcels that were intended for the soldiers. But that was not uncommon, because that happened other places also. That was one way you could reward somebody for doing what they did, and it didn't cost you more than a nickel. In a sense, land was cheap then. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the general's medical experience. As I said, he came over on an English ship of war. He was a surgeon. We don't know anything about his life on the boat. No, I'll throw this in. When World War II broke out, there were paper drives. Some of you may remember this. Paper drives all over the place. And I was told, yeah, there was a trunk full of letters and stuff, General John Williams, and they gave it to the paper drive. Well, there goes history up in flames, in a sense. There are a whole lot of places where you can find stuff. The New York State Public Library, Cornell University has a lot of Williams stuff in it. The Newberry Library, imagine that in Chicago. There's a reason for that. As people moved from New York State going west, and they had these materials, they said, what am I going to do with them? So they'd run to the nearest library and say, here, put them in your archives. So that's why they in fact, some of them even ended up in Hawaii, believe it or not. So what did Williams do? Two interesting stories as a surgeon. He fought as a soldier or was a surgeon in just about every event that happened here. I mentioned Skeensboro, Ticonderoga, well, they never got there because the fort was captured by the English before then, but he did participate with the militia in Fort Anne at that time. Then we had the German soldiers coming down and going to the Battle of Bennington, which is really in New York State. They had a better person writing up the event than anybody in New York State, I guess. So they went to Bennington, went to Saratoga Springs, and in Saratoga Springs, again, Governor Clinton said, bring your militia to Saratoga Springs, and you will be the blocker on the west side of the Hudson River. And there are a lot of first-hand reports of people who were there at that time. When he fought at the Battle of Monmouth, he was there as a surgeon, not a fighting soldier. But he had one of his servants with him by the name of Congo, which implies that this is an African servant that he's talking about. And his good friend was in the battle, and he did not return one day from a battle that was going on. So he and his servant went off into the battlefield at the end of the day looking for him, and they found him, and his left arm had been smashed by a mini ball. And he does what all surgeons do. He removed the arm. And, you know, when he brought the soldier back to his medical tent and took care of it. And that person lived a good life after that. The other interesting thing that he did, there was a person in Rupert who cut down a tree. Unfortunately, the tree fell on him, fractured his skull, and the doctor at that time was Abram Allen, and so he rushed to the person's home, looked at him and said, because the head was swelling, but he said, I think he needs to be trepanned. Now, trepanning is a fancy name for drilling a hole in the head to release the pressure. And he did that and left, and the person seemed to be getting better. But then he got another call saying, you have to come quickly. My husband's not doing well. So Abram Allen went out and said, he needs a second trepanning. But the man's wife said, no, we're not going to do that. Not going to do that, and sent him away. And unfortunately, her husband died. But Abram Allen thought he was right. So what did he do? He broke the law. After this person had been buried in a Revolutionary War cemetery, he dug the body up, which was against English law. But he didn't take the body. He just took the head. And then he called in Dr. Williams for a consultation. So they both sat in his office, which is still there, next to the post office on West Broadway. And Dr. Williams agreed. He said, I think you're right. If you had been able to trepan the second time, could have saved his life. In the meantime, someone had seen the doctor at the cemetery digging up the body and turned him into the local fuzz. So he got arrested, went to court. They heard all the witnesses, all the doctors and citizens, and there was only one way the judge could rule, because the law says you can't dig up bodies. So he fined him 50 pounds for doing that and kissed him goodbye. And then the next day there was a parade down Main Street with Dr. Allen, his servant, and a buggy as they carried the head back to the cemetery to rebury it. So, a little gruesome, but yet those are the things that happened back then.
But they weren't bombed at that time.
No, not that I'm aware of, unless, well, the Egyptians knew how to embalm. Okay. Now, it seems like John Williams was never a civilian. He always seemed to be either in the military or doing something else. But later on in his life, as I said, he was very interested in the growth of the county. He initially dammed up White Creek, just about a quarter of a mile from here, and put 2 sawmills on the creek. And then he decided, that's quite a distance. Maybe we could do that on the main drag, which he did. Where the shirt shop is, used to be his mill. Well, how am I going to get it there? And I'll build a ditch, which he did. You had the mill pond, and on a good day, you can look across this field over here and see where the canal or the ditch was. Just running from that mill pond to Main Street to the water wheel that ran his mill. That was his own personal project. A few years later, he was a good proponent of canal work. The mode of traffic at that time, you either walked or you had a horse and a buggy or a wagon, and it took you forever to get to where you wanted to go. And his concept was, if we build canals, you'll be a lot faster. You don't have to feed a canal boat, or you don't have to stop at a rest stop. And therefore, what we know as the Champlain Canal and the Erie Canal came from his insisting that canals be built. And without his pressure, we probably wouldn't have that today. Both canals are still operating. Granted, they were upgraded. The original canals, were small. I think there's an example of how small as you enter Fort Edward from Argyle on the right side of the road. You can see the old canal walls. So he was very influential. The other project he had was turnpikes. We have to remember that roads back then, you say, oh yeah, there was a road. The first road coming into Salem was from Whitehall, was Gainsborough. But a road then was, if it's wide enough for a wagon, that's it. There were trails practically. So he was on the board of directors for what we used to call the Northern Turnpike, Lansingburg to Whitehall. Today it's Route 22, but now it goes all the way down to New York City. You can get on it in New York City and go right up to the Canadian border. But again, that was Dr. Williams' interest and pressure to create a better way for people to get their goods to market. So,
But didn't you have to pay a toll from every toll thing all the
the
way?
question was there a toll? Yes. On the turnpike, there were tolls. In fact, I think there is one toll house still in existence, maybe just above, I don't know, I can't remember the name of the town. At any rate, on the way out, going north toward Granville, there's a place that supposedly that was their toll booth.
Sleepville. Not Sleepville.
No, not Slate.
There's one mule shack still standing too.
Yeah.
Going on Moses Hill.
Now, I mentioned Tories and the fact that John Williams was a wealthy person. Having that amount of money when he married Susanna Turner, gave him the opportunity, when it occurred, to purchase very, very cheaply the abandoned lands of the Tories. In effect, he owned most of the county, which was, just he owned most of Whitehall, and like 3,000 acres. He just had land all over the place. Now that makes him sound like a money-grubbing landholder. What did he do with all that stuff? Well, in some instances, he benevolently gave the land for certain purposes. In Whitehall, he built the Presbyterian Church. In Salem, he helped build the Presbyterian churches here. The first school was built by him here in 1780. And then schools that came after the wooden school burned down, and they decided maybe they ought to build them out of brick, which they did. But he footed the bill for building those brick buildings. In fact, Salem Washington Academy is still on West Broadway. It's now called Academy Apartments. He was also a member of the Board of Regents, who were very interested in education, helping communities, helping us to grow, helping, we'll call them farmers, but at that time agriculture was the commerce here in the community. Thus you had the canals and the roads, because they had to take their stuff to market all the way down to Troy to do that. The reason he built sawmills was same thing. People would have to take their logs miles and miles to get them cut. So he had a good brain for business. Now I want to talk just a little bit about John Wesley Jarvis. John Wesley Jarvis was an artist of his time, and John Wesley Jarvis came here to do some painting. The Williamses invited him to come here to paint the family. And there is a book out called John Wesley Jarvis, which shows all the portraits of the Williams family and the Proudfoot family that were done. A woman by the name of Wendy Allen is sort of a distant relative, and she has for years tried to find those paintings. They've been handed down from one generation to another. But last year when I talked with her, she said, yes, I found them. She said they went up for auction at such and such a house. One was in South Carolina, one was in North Carolina. So most of them have been sold. The only portrait we have here of a member of the Williams family hangs in the public library here on Main Street. And that's not General John Williams, it's his son, Colonel Williams. And that's done by Jarvis. So a beautiful portrait. And that came from a woman whose name I do not remember, but she found it at the Frick Museum, and made contact with us and said, would you like this? I said, sure, because it's really the only portrait that we have of any of the Williamses. So the other items are, they're in somebody's hands, but we don't know where they went. We don't know who bought them at the auction.
They may not even know whose portrait they're looking at. They may not know who that person is in that portrait.
Yeah, well, it's a local person.
I mean, the people that own those portraits now,
Oh, yeah.
they probably have it because of who painted it, but don't know who the person is.
Yeah, they might. That does happen. And occasionally it's maybe someone who sees value in it and is just trying to turn it over.
There's no way you can trace from the auction house who bought those?
I think Wendy tried to, and I'm not sure. They may feel that's confidential. information and won't give it up. The last thing I want to talk about, sort of an interesting item. I said John Williams was involved in politics almost all of his life. And his daughters, of course, they married. And I mentioned that John was an anti-federalist. So you had the anti-federalists and the federalists, at odds ends. The conflict, if anybody here see Hamilton, anybody see that musical? The conflict in Hamilton and Aaron Burr has a relationship to Salem. According to Harriet Williams, who wrote a book called The Salem Book, Aaron Burr was a visitor here in the mansion at Salem. John Williams knew Hamilton just from the politics and in the service of the country. But one of his daughters got married to a man who was in a different party. And he was a general also, General Thomas. And I just want to read to you the problem. General Thomas ran against John Williams in an election, and John Williams lost. But they would argue all the time over politics. And one day it came to a head, and General Thomas challenged him to a duel. Remember, this was a time when dueling was acceptable. Somebody insulted you, you would take your glove off and throw it on the ground and say, "Meet me at sunrise with your seconds." At any rate, Thomas said, "Okay, we're going to have a duel. We'll settle it that way." So they got ready to do that. And just to read, I'll read this to you because it is interesting. The one General John Williams, prominent citizen, revolutionary veteran, and orator of parts and throughout his political life, was an ardent Whig. The other General, David Thomas, also a veteran of the Revolution, whose advocacy of the tenets of the newly born Democratic Party almost approached pure fanaticism. As the campaign neared its climax, the increasingly vitriolic personal attacks by members of both parties eventually engendered such serious animosity between these two men that Thomas challenged Williams to a duel. The good people of Salem were horrified at the prospect of blood being spilled between members of the village, his most prominent family, Thomas being the husband of William's stepdaughter. Nevertheless, despite loudly voiced public protest and the pleas of the resident clergy, the principals of the proposed Passion at Arms, Judge Anthony Blanchard, acting for Williams, and James Hawley for Thomas. At the preliminary conference, it was agreed principals and seconds would meet for the encounter a week hence at an early morning hour on the north side of Gallows Hill. I should point out, Gallows Hill, as you go north out of Salem, the Catholic Church is on the left and you go up the hill. The road used to go straight. That's known as Gallows Hill. And you can imagine why. During this interim, Thomas was observed to be assiduously practicing at pistol shooting, and it was remarked by those who watched that his proficiency with the arm was a little short of phenomenal. On the designated day and hour, Thomas and his second proceeded to the chosen site, and after waiting a lengthy time, finally convinced themselves that Williams did not intend to appear. They then returned to Thomas's home, a palatial brick residence now occupied by the Abrams stores. Those of you who don't, that's the large building on the main drag. And Thomas dispatched a formal note to Williams requesting that he call upon him immediately. After a very considerable delay, Williams, unattended by his second, brusquely walked into the parlor of the Thomas home. Upon the center table lay a pair of loaded dueling pistols, from which Thomas's second indicated he was to take his choice and place himself at the further end of the room. Thomas, meanwhile, sitting motionless as the statue, and as pale of countenance, Williams walked to the table and picking up a pistol remarked, why, what pretty toys you boys have here. And without further ado, cocked the arm and fired it. The ball lodging in the outside wall of the room. The women of the family, who had assembled about the stairs in an excruciating state of suspense, upon hearing the shot, immediately rushed down the staircase and tried to open the bolted door, fully expecting to find a father or a husband dead or dying. Williams, meanwhile, replaced the empty pistol on the table and slowly turning to his embittered audience, launched a tirade, half serious, half facetious, against the senseless practice of dueling, admonishing them that it settled nothing whatsoever, not even the mooted point of honor. Apparently, his argument carried so much weight that Thomas, evidently disarmed of his rancor, arose, crossed the room, and extended his hand to General Williams. And it was in this attitude of friendliness that the family came upon them when the door was finally unbolted, that they were able to enter the room. From this moment on, in spite of political differences, the men remained the foremost of friends for the remaining years of General Williams' life. Thus ended Salem's only known brush with dueling. However, dueling among all walks of life continued in the United States until the end of the Civil War, when the public, not legislative action, had shown its objection to publicly sanctioned bloodshed. It was too late for Hamilton, as we know. Aaron Burr, in a duel, killed Alexander Hamilton. It was the beginning of making the United States a civil nation.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
Questions?
I was wondering about, he built houses for his daughters.
Yes,
Some of them are still up.
they're here. You've seen the Williams mansion on that form that went around. That was right across the street. When his daughters got married, he built the house where the Clarys live. It's the house next to the school. And the house next to that, where the funeral parlor is the second house that he built for one of his daughters, and they got married.
Okay.
So he built well. They're very substantial homes.
Yeah.
Was the house across the street, the Audubon house?
No, that was not one of his. Just another aspect of Salem. We call it the Audubon house because Audubon's granddaughters lived in that house for many, many years. Other questions?
The place you talked about next to the post office, is it the brick structure? that
Yeah,
had
the little
on
brick
there,
house.
is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I didn't know.
yeah. That's Alan's medical office. Yeah.
Isn't the Sherman House one of his gifts to a daughter? What I call the Sherman House on Main Street, with the pillars? I've always been told that.
Yeah, I was trying to think of which daughter. It would have been one of the daughters.
And I believe it was in 1800, exactly, the year.
Yeah, and then it burned.
Yeah, partially.
And,
then
yeah, and they
rebuilt.
rebuilt it.
So there was 3 houses in Salem that good thing he didn't have 10
Yes.
daughters.
Yeah, and he did not spare money. He hired really good architects. I wrote Sturbridge, Massachusetts one because I saw a mansion that looked somewhat like his here. But they wrote back and said, no, so-and-so wouldn't have done that. So we still don't know who did the Williams house here in town.
Some of the portraits might have burnt in some of those fires
Here,
of the family that you said he had painted. An artist came and painted them.
yeah, well, I think not, because I think by that time, the family, Williams family would still have had those at the house. And then I think the relatives, descendants finally walked away with them. That house is unusual. Some of it was reused. We bought a house on Main Street and it has a beautiful stairway going up. And one day flipping through the interior, pictures of the Williams mansion. There's the railing. Well, when we bought the house, the guy had said, oh yeah, that came from the Williams mansion, and I just shrugged it off.
Yeah,
He wants to sell the place.
you had proof
But
then.
there it was.
Yeah.
Is there photographic evidence of those portraits, those paintings that are missing somewhere?
Yeah, in fact, I have the book in the file. I don't know whether the library has one or not, but it's the Jarvis book. Tells of the Jarvis history and the portraits that he did. So the Williams portraits and the Proudfit portraits are in that book.
Could that be put out in the magic world of the internet and say, have you seen this?
Well,
Do you have it?
Wendy Allen does that, and I just kind of left it up to her to continue the research.
So that is something ongoing then.
Yeah, well, I think it's being done through her. But you could research it on your own if you wanted to.
It would be kind of neat to have those returned here to Salem.
Well, I don't think they'll ever be returned. I think that whoever has bought them is going to keep them.
But like somebody said, they probably only know they got a pretty face, but what's the connection? Or maybe there is a connection.
Yeah, that might be.
But I'm glad to hear there's actual photo of these different paintings. They didn't. This auction you talked about, or auctions, was when? In the 20th century, in the 1930s, or 1800s?
With the auctions, no, they were modern.
They would have,
They were, let's see, Wendy, about 2018, 19. You know, they were only a few years back that they came. But again, I think, like everything else, as you work through your heirs or your descendants, by the time you get through 7 layers, people say, what do I want this for? So they take it to an auction house and it gets sold. It has no meaning to them.
would they have been listed in the catalog of the auction?
Probably at one time.
Where can we get a copy of that?
I don't know. I don't have the auction house name here. Other questions?
You mentioned James Turner's widow, Susan, married John Williams.
Right.
Oh, you know what her maiden name was?
No.
Okay, but you did mention right after that Bancroft and Proudfoot names. Were they related or just neighbors?
Well, through marriage.
Okay.
Well, the Martins were also involved too, because some of the Williamses married into the Martin family. And there is one descendant left. She lives on the West Coast, who kind of keeps in track. She just did a big genealogy on the Martins. So,
The Turners were one of the first settlers here, huh?
yes, yeah. They would have come in 1764. They came from Pelham, Massachusetts, where they owned a tavern. Yeah, so they came with money.
Must have walked or had
They
horses.
did, no, they did walk. That was the only way to get here.
Wow.
People walked every place.
Couldn't bring your furniture that way.
Oh, well, the story is,
Sal?
they wanted a dining room table. So what they did was they cut a tree down and left a big stump and they built a house around it.
That was the table.
That was the table.
Yep.
Al, thank you very much.
Thanks
Was
a
it
lot,
interesting
Al.
meeting you?